Beijing, March 14th, 11:47 in the morning local time. Inside the Great Hall of the People, one of the most symbolically loaded buildings on the face of this earth, a senior Chinese trade official slides a single document across a table. The Canadian delegation sitting across from him has been in the building for less than 2 hours. They haven't even finished their tea. On the other side of the planet, in Ottawa, it is 10:47 at night. Mark Carney is on a secure call. His trade minister is in the room. So is his national security advisor. Nobody is relaxed. The call lasts exactly 34 minutes. When it ends, Carney doesn't speak immediately. He asks for the document to be printed. He reads it once, then he says 3 words. Get it done. Washington knew none of this was happening, not because the information was being hidden from them, not because Canada was running some kind of covert operation behind closed doors, but because the assumption inside the White House, baked so deeply into American strategic thinking that nobody bothered to question it anymore, was that China would never make this kind of offer to Canada. That Beijing reserved this category of agreement exclusively for relationships it considered strategically essential. And Canada, inside the American framework, was a junior partner, a reliable supplier, a friendly neighbor, not an independent actor capable of attracting this level of attention from Beijing on its own terms. That assumption was wrong. And the document sitting on that table in the Great Hall of the People on March 14th was the proof. China had just offered Canada something it had never formally offered the United States. And Carney had just said yes, stay with me. Because what was actually in that document, why Beijing chose Canada over every other option available to it, and what this means for the future of global power is a story that most people have not heard told in full. And once you understand it, you will not look at the map of the world the same way again. To understand why this offer was extraordinary, you have to first understand how China actually structures its most important economic relationships, because Beijing is not casual about this. It never has been. It builds these relationships in layers, and each layer carries a completely different strategic weight. At the base level, China has standard trade relationships with most of the world. Goods move, tariffs get negotiated, companies invest. These are transactional, functional. They exist with almost every major economy on Earth, and they carry no particular strategic significance beyond the numbers on a spreadsheet. Most countries think they have a meaningful relationship with China because trade volumes are high. They don't understand which layer they're actually on. One level up, China has what it internally describes as comprehensive strategic partnerships. These involve coordinated policy alignment, technology cooperation, infrastructure investment, and a degree of access to Chinese industrial systems that standard trade partners simply never receive. There are relatively few of these relationships. Beijing manages them carefully. The countries inside them get treatment that countries outside them never see. And then, above that, there is a third category, one that almost no Western country has ever been offered. A category that involves something Beijing considers its single most sensitive strategic asset: preferential access to critical mineral processing infrastructure, rare earth supply chains, and next-generation clean energy technology that China has spent 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars turning into something that functions, in practice, like a monopoly. Let that sink in for a second. China controls approximately 60% of the world's rare earth mining. But mining is not the leverage. The leverage is processing. And China controls over 85% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. It dominates the global supply chain for the materials needed to build electric vehicle batteries, advanced semiconductors, military-grade electronics, next-generation clean energy systems. No other country on Earth comes remotely close. For years, Washington tried to negotiate access to this processing infrastructure. Senior officials, back-channel conversations, formal proposals. The answer from Beijing was always effectively the same: no. Because offering America preferential access to the technology and supply chains that represent China's primary strategic leverage over the Western industrial world would be like handing your opponent your most powerful card mid-game. It would be irrational. And whatever Beijing is, it is not irrational. What China offered Canada on March 14th was a structured framework for joint development of rare earth processing technology on Canadian soil, using Chinese industrial knowledge, Canadian raw materials, and a governance structure that gave Ottawa meaningful control over the output. Not full control, but meaningful control. Enough to matter strategically. Enough that the offer was categorically different from anything Beijing had ever put in front of an American negotiator. Think about that for a moment. China sat down with Canada and said, "We will share processing technology we have never shared with the United States." Ask yourself why. The answer is not complicated once you follow the logic. Beijing does not want to strengthen its primary geopolitical rival. But it absolutely does want to weaken the assumption that the United States controls all decisions made by its closest allies. Every time a country Washington considers inside its orbit makes an independent economic decision of genuine strategic weight, it slightly erodes the architecture of American-led economic dominance that Beijing views as its primary long-term obstacle. Canada was not chosen randomly. It was chosen precisely because of what it is: resource-rich, technologically capable, increasingly frustrated with Washington, and governed, at this particular moment in history, by a prime minister whose entire background in global finance gave him both the credibility and the patience to evaluate an offer of this complexity without either panicking or overcommitting. Carney was not a politician who stumbled into a big moment. He was exactly the kind of decision-maker Beijing had been waiting for in Ottawa. The groundwork for March 14th was laid during Carney's January visit to Beijing, the first visit by a Canadian prime minister to China in nearly a decade. Most of the coverage at the time treated it as a diplomatic reset, a goodwill gesture, a signal that Ottawa wanted to diversify its trade relationships without committing to anything specific. And that reading was not wrong, but it was deeply incomplete. Because alongside the public meetings, the state banquet, and the carefully managed photo opportunities, a separate set of conversations was happening in rooms that no camera ever entered. Canadian officials were meeting with their counterparts from China's Ministry of Commerce, the National Development and Reform Commission, and representatives of 3 state-owned enterprises directly involved in rare earth processing and clean energy technology development. Those conversations were exploratory at first. Both sides were testing the other. China was assessing whether Canada had the political will to proceed with an agreement that Washington would view as a direct challenge to American supply chain strategy. Canada was assessing whether Beijing was genuinely prepared to offer something substantive, or whether this was just another exercise in diplomatic signaling with nothing concrete attached. By February, Ottawa had its answer. A Chinese technical delegation arrived in Canada quietly. No press release. No public announcement. They spent 4 days in closed meetings with Canadian officials from Natural Resources Canada, the Department of Innovation, and the newly created Critical Minerals Strategic Office that Carney had established in his first month as Prime Minister. Think about that timeline. He created that office in his first month. That is not a coincidence. What the delegation brought was not a vague proposal. It was a framework, detailed, technically specific, and structured in a way that immediately told every Canadian official in the room that this had not been assembled quickly. The level of detail suggested preparation that had been underway for months, possibly longer. Beijing had been planning this offer carefully. Canada was not an improvised target. It was a chosen one. The framework covered 3 interconnected areas that together added up to something Canada had never had access to before. First, a joint processing facility to be built in northern Ontario, using Canadian lithium, cobalt, and rare earth deposits combined with Chinese processing technology that has no Western equivalent. Second, a technology transfer arrangement covering specific stages of the battery cathode manufacturing process. Knowledge that China had never formally shared with any Western partner. Not Germany, not Japan, not the United States. Nobody. And third, a preferential supply agreement guaranteeing Canada priority access to processed rare earth materials for its domestic manufacturing sector over a 15-year period. Each element alone would have been significant. Together, they represented something that Canada's critical minerals industry had never had: a credible path to processing independence that didn't require building an entirely new industrial base from scratch over 20 years of painful, expensive trial and error. When the Canadian delegation arrived in Beijing on March 14th, the document on the table was the formalized version of all of that, refined, legally structured, ready for a decision, not a signing. Both sides understood that formal ratification would take time, that there were domestic political considerations to navigate on both sides. But a decision in principle, a yes or a no. Carney said yes. And Washington found out 36 hours later through its own intelligence channels. Let that image settle. The most powerful country in the history of the modern world learned that its closest neighbor and most integrated economic partner had just agreed to a landmark strategic framework with its primary geopolitical rival, not through a phone call, not through diplomatic notification, but through its own spy apparatus, a day and a half after the fact. The initial assessment that landed on the desk of the National Security Council described the agreement in careful, measured language. A preliminary framework. Details still unclear. Formal ratification uncertain. But underneath the measured language, the implications were immediately understood. Because the specific elements of the framework, rare earth processing, battery cathode technology, 15-year supply guarantees, touched directly on 3 separate American strategic priorities that had been formally identified as critical national security concerns in the most recent National Defense Industrial Strategy. The United States had spent years and enormous amounts of money trying to build alternative rare earth processing capacity outside China. Billions invested in domestic mining projects, incentives offered to allied nations to develop processing infrastructure. The entire Inflation Reduction Act structured specifically to reward North American critical mineral supply chains. The entire architecture of that strategy assumed Canada was a reliable partner inside an American-led framework, not an independent actor negotiating bilateral arrangements with Beijing that created parallel supply chains operating entirely outside American oversight. The phone call from Washington to Ottawa came within 48 hours. People familiar with the conversation describe it as direct. American officials wanted to understand what Canada had agreed to, whether it was binding, what it meant for existing North American critical mineral cooperation frameworks. Ottawa's response was equally direct. Canada had agreed to a preliminary framework. The details were still being worked through, and Canada's decisions about its own resource development and industrial policy were sovereign decisions that Ottawa would make based on Canadian interests in consultation with allies where appropriate, but not subject to American veto. Not subject to American veto. That phrase, that specific phrase, was the one that landed hardest in Washington. Because it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't hostile. It didn't come with threats or ultimatums or dramatic press conferences. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered calmly and clearly by a government that had clearly decided it was prepared to say it out loud when the moment required it. Washington had no clean countermove. Sanctioning Canada was not a realistic option. Threatening new tariff escalation on top of existing tensions carried enormous political costs with no guaranteed outcome. And publicly condemning an ally for making an economic agreement with a third country, however strategically uncomfortable it was a position that would be impossible to defend in front of every other American ally watching closely to see how Washington handled the situation. So Washington said very little publicly. And in that silence, the signal became louder than any statement could have been. Here is the part that almost no coverage has properly connected. The Canada-China Rare Earth Framework is not primarily a story about minerals. Minerals are the vehicle. The story is about what happens when the assumption of automatic allied alignment breaks down in a specific, measurable, economically concrete way. For decades, the architecture of Western economic strategy rested on a set of assumptions so widely shared they were almost never examined directly. One of those assumptions was that Canada's resource sector was effectively part of the North American economic system, available to American industrial policy as a reliable input, governed by trade rules designed substantially in Washington's interest, and unlikely under any realistic scenario to make independent strategic decisions that conflicted with American supply chain priorities. March 14th broke that assumption in a specific and durable way. Not because Canada is abandoning the Western alliance. It isn't. Not because Carney has decided Beijing is a more important relationship than Washington. He hasn't. But because Ottawa demonstrated, with a concrete economic decision of genuine strategic weight, that it is capable of acting in Canadian interests even when those interests create real friction with American strategic preferences. That demonstration matters enormously, not just for Canada. For every resource-rich middle power on Earth that has been receiving similar approaches from Beijing for years and hesitating because the assumption was that Washington's reaction would make the cost too high. Australia has rare earths. Chile has lithium. Indonesia has nickel. The Democratic Republic of Congo has cobalt. All of them have been watching. All of them have been running the same calculation in their own capitals. Is the offer from Beijing genuinely worth the friction with Washington? Is the friction manageable? Or does saying yes to China mean paying a price we can't afford? Canada just changed that calculation. If a country as deeply integrated with the United States as Canada, sharing the longest undefended border in the world, deeply tied by culture, history, economics, and military alliance, if that country can say yes to a Beijing framework agreement and absorb Washington's reaction without suffering catastrophic consequences, then the threshold for every other middle power just moved. The cost of saying yes to China got lower. The assumption of automatic and overwhelming American reaction got weaker. And Beijing's ability to offer these agreements and have them accepted just increased in ways that will compound with every subsequent agreement that follows. That is the strategic multiplier effect hidden underneath the headlines about processing facilities and supply chains. One agreement in Northern Ontario will not by itself reshape the global rare earth industry. But the precedent it sets, that a close American ally can make an independent strategic economic decision involving China without being effectively punished for it, that precedent ripples outward in ways that are very difficult to contain once they begin moving. And Mark Carney almost certainly understood exactly that when he said those three words at 10:47 p.m. on a secure call in Ottawa while his trade minister and national security advisor stood in the same room and said nothing. Get it done wasn't just an instruction about a minerals deal. It was a statement about the kind of country Canada has decided to be, in a world where the old assumptions are no longer reliable, the old frameworks are under pressure from every direction, and the countries that wait for permission to act in their own interests may find that the window to act has already closed by the time they finally move. The formal ratification of the framework will take time. There are regulatory processes, environmental assessments, community consultations, and parliamentary scrutiny still ahead. This is not a story about a building that went up overnight. But the decision has been made. And in geopolitics, the decision is almost always more important than the implementation, because the decision tells every watching party what the decision maker believes, what they are prepared to do, and where the actual limits of their independence sit, as opposed to where everyone had always assumed those limits were. What unfolds next will happen in layers. Other countries will test whether what Canada did is replicable for them. Beijing will receive more serious interest from resource-rich middle powers who previously held back. Washington will face pressure from multiple partners simultaneously rather than being able to manage each situation individually, with the full weight of American leverage focused in one direction at a time. The domestic politics inside Canada will intensify sharply. Not every province, not every industry, and not every political voice in Canada will support what Carney has agreed to. The opposition will frame it as a security risk. Some allies will express concern through private channels while staying publicly quiet. The debate about Canada's relationship with China, which has been building beneath the surface for years, will move from the background to the absolute center of Canadian political life. That debate will be loud, and it will be uncomfortable, and it will force Canada to have conversations about its own identity and its own interests that it has been able to avoid for a generation. But underneath all of that noise, the structural shift will be compounding quietly. Because a Canada with independent rare earth processing capacity is a different negotiating partner than a Canada without it. A Canada with a 15-year supply guarantee operating outside the American framework has options it did not previously have. And options in international relations are the only form of power that actually persists across changing political seasons, shifting administrations, and the inevitable moments when the relationship with even your closest ally becomes complicated. Trump was on television that morning, performing for cameras, negotiating tariffs in public, doing what he does. By the time his press conference ended, the most consequential economic decision Canada had made in a generation was already moving forward in a room he didn't know existed, in a building on the other side of the world, involving a document he hadn't read and a phone call he wasn't on. That is the difference between performance and strategy. One requires cameras and an audience and constant noise. The other requires a secure phone line, a document, a room with the right people in it, and 3 words spoken quietly at 10:47 at night by a man who had clearly decided that Canada was done waiting for permission. China offered Canada what it never offered America. Canada said yes. Washington found out through its own intelligence channels 36 hours later. And the world, for anyone paying close enough attention, is already different because of it. That is not a trade story. That is a power story. And power, once it shifts, rarely shifts back.